Thank you so much for coming and celebrating with us this evening. Whether you're a regular or whether this is the first time you've ever come, it's such a joy to be together to celebrate this good news. And my job in the next few minutes really is just to help us, whether this is all new or whether we've heard it 1,000 times, to enjoy how good the news of Christmas really is. And to revel in it in a world that is full of bad news and a week that's full of bad news, to enjoy and kind of realize afresh this incredibly good news. And I want to just start with Yuri Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin was the Soviet astronaut who was the first human being to get out of the Earth's atmosphere and into outer space. And the story goes that when he had kind of orbited the Earth, come down, landed, that he got out of the landing pod and said, well, I had a look, and I couldn't see God up there. And apparently C.S. Lewis, who was still alive and writing at the time, wrote an article in a newspaper responding to that, where he basically said that's a lot like Hamlet trying to find Shakespeare by climbing up into the attic. He says that doesn't work. If you are a character, however high you climb in the world of the play, you can't find the author. And he said similarly for us, if you are a created being living in a created world, however high you might climb in that creation, however many experiments you might do, however much you might explore, you will never be able to sort of find the creator hiding in a corner somewhere. And I don't know about you, but when I sort of hear that, there's always a kind of skeptical part of me that responds by kind of going, well, yeah, exactly. We've never seen God. Why would we believe in an author if we can't see him, if we can't find him anywhere? If there was a creator God, why wouldn't he just make it a bit more obvious? Why wouldn't he just show himself? I think a lot of us are naturally skeptical as we look around the world and we don't see God. And to be honest, I'm also quite naturally skeptical in a carol service. You hear all of these readings, and maybe we're used to the story, but actually you just hear it and you think this is full of such weird stuff. There are angels delivering messages, angels singing songs. The central plot point is a woman giving birth with no human father, just by the power of God's Holy Spirit. This is really weird. It is really hard to believe. It feels just kind of unrealistic because these kinds of things just don't happen, do they? But I find what C.S. Lewis said next in that article really interesting. He said, if Shakespeare did want Hamlet to know him, to know who he was, to know what he was like, there is one way Shakespeare could do it. He says Shakespeare could write himself into the play. He could write a character called William Shakespeare and walk on stage himself and say, hello, I'm your author. Nice to meet you. And that is what our Creator has done in Jesus. That is what Christmas is celebrating. He came down to earth from heaven, who is God and Lord of all. I love verse 18 of that reading we had from John's Gospel. No one has ever seen God. You know, he's not a created thing that you can find in the created world. You can't see him like a rock or a cloud. He's the author, and you can't see him in the world of the play. But the one and only Son, who is himself God, has made him known. The author of our world has written himself into the story. In Jesus, God becomes a human being. He walks onto the stage of human history and he introduces himself. He makes himself known. And John got that straight from the lips of Jesus himself. There's a brilliant conversation later on in his biography of Jesus where a friend of Jesus, Philip, says to him, Jesus, would you just show us God? That would be enough for us. And you can almost imagine Jesus smiling at him as he replies, don't you know me, Philip, after I've been among you for such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen God. Jesus said, if you want to meet God, look no further. That is what Christmas is about. And the interesting thing is, if we see that, it actually turns out that our two sort of skeptical instincts resolve one another. They actually kind of answer each other. Why wouldn't God just show himself? Well, in Jesus, he has. Why are all these things so weird, so hard to believe, so completely odd? Well, precisely because God is trying to make himself obvious. God is doing something, angels, miracles. We find those things really hard to believe because they just don't happen. But that's exactly the point. They don't normally happen. They just happen this once to make it blindingly obvious that this is not an ordinary human being. They are like a kind of huge spotlight shining onto this baby, this character that has just come onto the stage of human history and saying, this is not a character like every other character. This is the author. Pay attention. Look at this boy. Because he is God becoming a human being. He is God making himself known. And so do you see that it doesn't actually make any sense for us to say to God, well, look, show yourself. Do something utterly unique and obvious. Do something that cannot be explained by science. And then to read the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' birth, of Jesus' life, of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, and say, well, that can't be explained by science, so I can't believe that. See that actually the only intellectually honest response to the real meaning of Christmas, I would say, is to take a really serious, thoughtful look at who Jesus actually was. And I think that is such good news for us. Because we can't climb up high enough with our own powers of discovery to find the answers to the great questions of life, to find whether or not we are just a cosmic accident or whether we have some kind of genuine meaning. There's a secular sociologist who writes about the search for meaning as being the search for to know that we are not just fidgeting as we wait for death. We long to find meaning. We long to find answers. But we can't climb up high enough of our own accord to find answers to these great questions. But what if God climbed down to find us and introduce himself? He came down to earth from heaven, who is God and Lord of all. But for many of us, that actually then raises a much deeper, harder question. If he is there, does he care? We've probably, I think, in the last couple of years, all felt that question on some level. As we've seen sort of what's happened around us, at some point we kind of thought, are we on our own here, or is there someone out there? And if there is, has he just abandoned us? Does he not care about us? Let me share another story that's a true story that I think about a lot at Christmas. In the 1880s, in Hawaii, if you had leprosy, they basically rounded you up and shipped you off to one specific island where only people with leprosy lived, and they just left you there, essentially to die without infecting anyone else. And there was a man called Father Damien, who's a priest who went from Belgium to Hawaii to serve there, and when he found out what was happening, he said, I want to move to that island. I want to go there. And he did. He moved to that island, and he lived with them, and he helped them. He helped them build hospitals and roads and orphanages. But he didn't want to live at a distance from them, like they were sort of second class, like they were unclean. He wanted to be with them, and so he ate with them, and he tended to their wounds and treated their illnesses. He held their hands. He buried their dead. And the time came when he looked and he saw that he had burns and blisters on his skin, but he couldn't feel the pain. And that Sunday in the church, he didn't make a big announcement, but instead of saying, you lepers, like he normally did, he said, we lepers. And he stayed and he loved them and he served them until he died there. Now imagine how you would have felt if you were one of those people living on that island. Before he came, how much you would have just felt forgotten and worthless. But then what would it have felt like To know that this man who had become your friend, even though he didn't have to, no one was making him, no one was even asking him, that he cared about you so much, that he wanted to be with you, even though he knew it would mean suffering with you and even dying with you. And Christmas says to us, that is how much God cares about us. That is how much God cares about you. That he chose to come, even though he didn't have to. We heard in that reading, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. In Jesus, the eternal, immortal God became a flesh and blood human being and moved in with us. He became vulnerable and mortal to be with us. I love that line in Once in Royal David City. He was little, weak, and helpless. I love that that's in a carol. Why is that something that we're excited about, that we're celebrating, that we're praising God for? He was little, weak, and helpless because that is how much God cares. He took on our humanity fully, genuinely. He was born covered in blood and crying like every other human baby. He willingly took on the ability to be hurt, to bleed, to be scared, to be lonely, even to die. He chose to suffer with us like Father Damien did. That is how much you matter to God. He was little, weak, and helpless when he was born, and he was little, weak, and helpless as he died. And he did it all because he cares about us. But why? What's it all for? What's the point of God doing all of this for us in Jesus? Well, there's 1,000 things that I could say about that, but I think it kind of boils down to the difference between New Year's resolutions and Christmas Day. If it was announced somehow that there was only room in the depths of winter for one annual tradition, and there was a referendum to choose between abolishing Christmas and abolishing New Year's resolutions, I wonder which one we would choose. They respond to the dark and the cold in very, very different ways. See, New Year's resolutions is like, okay, here are all of the ways that we feel we ought to be a better person. And here are the steps that we can take to do that. Here is the kind of ladder we need to climb in order to get there. But the problem is, of course, we never live up to it. We always mess it up, and then we end up just back where we started, but feeling kind of guilty and rubbish about ourselves. And a lot of religion, and to be honest, a lot of how we tend to practice Christianity is a lot like New Year's resolutions. It's a ladder for us to climb up. It's a bunch of moral or ethical or spiritual or religious duties to fulfill, to live up to. And the idea is the hope is that we work hard enough, we climb up and up until eventually we are good enough that we become acceptable to God. And it is exhausting. But actually, I don't think that's just religious people. I think a lot of us, even if we don't believe in God at all, that's kind of how life feels for us. There's still a ladder for us to climb. It's just that at the top, it might not be being acceptable to God. It might be being acceptable to ourselves, or even being acceptable to the people whose opinion we value. Maybe for us, it's that we feel like we really need to become a more ethical person, make more of the right choices, make less mistakes, so that we won't have to feel guilty anymore. We will feel like we're good enough. Or maybe it's that we feel like we need to be more successful, we need to become a more successful person, achieve more, do better, so that we won't feel like a failure anymore. We'll feel like we're good enough. Or maybe it's that for us, we really feel like we need to have and maintain the perfect family life, the perfect social life, so that everybody's kept happy and we never feel vulnerable or lonely. We feel like we're good enough. Maybe for some of us, we feel like we're trying to climb all three of those ladders at once. And just like with New Year's resolutions, whether we're religious or not, there always comes a moment if we're trying to climb this ladder where we just get tired, where we mess it up, where we end up feeling guilty and inadequate and exhausted. But Jesus did not invent New Year's resolutions. Jesus doesn't want anything to do with New Year's resolutions. Jesus invented Christmas. I know that's not technically quite true, but Jesus is the founder of Christmas. And how does Christmas deal with the dark and the cold? Christmas says there's no ladder to climb. Christmas says, let's put lights up in the darkness. Let's get a fire going in the midst of the cold. Let's get a feast on the table and let's get the family together. And actually, that is a really good picture of what real Christianity is all about. Jesus does not burden us with all of the ways in which we really ought to become a better person. He does not show us a ladder that we need to climb to get up to God. He comes down to us instead. He says, I am God coming down to meet you in your darkness, your mess, your moral failure, and to embrace you and forgive you right there. He comes down into our darkness and he throws the door open wide and he says, whoever you are, whatever you've done, come in. It's freezing out there. There's a fire going in here. I've prepared a feast for you on the table. Pull up a chair. The whole family can't wait to meet you. That's Christianity. That's what Christmas is about, that invitation. Because in Jesus, God comes down to be with us so that we can be with him. God joins us in our darkness so we can join him in his light. God joins us in the cold of our broken relationships and our genuine guilt so that we can come and join him around the fire of God's love. So that our hearts can be melted and transformed by realizing, oh my goodness, this God knows me completely. He knows all of my moral failures. He knows all the ways I've tried to keep him at arm's length and pretend he's not there, that I don't owe him anything. He knows all of that, and he loves me utterly anyway. And the instant I come to him, he forgives me completely. He comes into our cold so that he can bring us into the warmth of that love and let it change us. Ultimately, in Jesus, God comes down to face even the deepest depths, the loneliness of death itself, for us, so that he can take hold of us right there. He can lift us up and he can bring us into his family feast, which starts now and lasts forever, and where there will never again be an empty seat at the table. See, I don't think the world needs more people weighed down by New Year's resolutions to be better people. The world needs more people who have come in and been warmed and transformed by that love, and who can go out and share that warmth and that welcome with everyone who's shivering and alone around them. So please, can I invite you, whether this is like the 1,000th time you've heard about Christmas, or if you don't believe in Jesus at all and this is quite new to you, as we sing this last carol, could you just take the chance to consider whether you've ever really grasped that God came down? That God has come into human history as a real human being so that we are not left to guess the meaning of life and where we came from, so that we can know who he is and what he's really like. That God cares about us so much that he came to suffer with us and die for us. And that it means we don't have to climb a ladder to get up and be acceptable enough for God, but that instead he comes down and meets us and embraces us in the midst of all our darkness. And could you ask yourself as well, what do you want to do about that? For you, it might be this is quite new to you, and what you want to do is be kind of intellectually honest with this stuff, is investigate. Is there any actual evidence that what I'm saying is true? For you, it might be that you feel, actually, I want to see more of Jesus. What is he actually like? You know, if God is like this, then what is God like? And maybe for you, you want to read one of the eyewitness accounts of his life. You want to see who he is. Or is it actually, for you, whether you've been a Christian for a long time, or this would be the first time you've ever done it, that you know that actually you just need to stop wearing yourself out trying to climb up and become acceptable to God. But you need to accept that invitation to just come in to the fire of his love, to the feast of knowing Jesus, and into the family of God's people, and accept his love and his forgiveness and his welcome. Let me just lead us in a prayer before we sing. Jesus, we thank you so much that you don't leave us lost and guessing. You come down to meet us and show us who you are. And thank you so much that you didn't leave us on our own in the darkness and pain. You came down to suffer with us and die for us. And thank you that you do not ask us to climb up to you, but you come down and embrace us and forgive us and welcome us into your family. Please, would you help us to come in this Christmas and to find rest? Amen.